what happened when he was there is a bubble. That's all the way you can describe it. There's no windows, there's no doors, nothing opens. Literally, a bubble slips off the side of the craft, separates from the side of the craft, floating in the air, 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and then the bubble divides into 3 separate bubbles. 1, 2, 3. And within each of the bubbles was the upper torso of a humanoid figure, wearing some kind of upper clothing. Very pale, very thin faces, kind of what you would say is a typical grey alien, big eyes, and basically they are hovering there. There's no speech of any kind, but it's like there's maybe some kind of telepathic communication going on.
You're watching and listening to Mind the Shift. I am Anders, your host. Today, I'm excited to have a conversation with a returning guest, leading UFO researcher Gary Heseltine. Welcome back, Gary.
It's always a pleasure, Anders. Thank you very much for inviting me back.
So my previous interview with you was recorded in Cusco in Peru. That was quite a nice setting, wasn't it? A bit different now, but
it was a beautiful setting.
It was, yeah. So those of you in the audience that haven't heard that one might want to check out that episode from November. So what has happened since then? Well, Gary, you've released a super interesting and important book called Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. There you go. So I finished the book just yesterday. It took me a while because it's really packed with information. And it's about the world's second most known UFO case after Roswell, I think. But having read the book, I really feel it ought to be number 1, actually. So what makes the book a little bit tough to read is also, I think, what will make this an indispensable RFI document. I mean, RFI meaning Rendlesham Forest Incident document, because you have really compiled everything, often verbatim, and transcripts from conversations over email or physically. It feels as you've turned every stone. Now, these events have no doubt had a lot of coverage in the media and elsewhere since they first emerged in the public back in, I think it was 1983. But you have nonetheless been able to produce a number of new mind-blowing disclosures, like new witnesses and new information from known witnesses. And you compiled a total of no less than 18 UFO encounters over 4 nights, or at least we think it's 4 nights. You think it's 4 nights. Could be more, could be less. And you also reveal an appalling amount of denial and cover-up from the military over the years. So, Gary, how has it been possible for you to dig up this much after this many years?
I surprised myself. I thought I knew the case really well from a researcher point of view, because I've been doing research on it privately for 20 odd years, and then I went public with my research in December 2007 when I was on an episode of UFO Hunters with Bill Burns. It was an American documentary series, and I met Colonel Charles Halt for the first time. And it wasn't until that time that I disclosed my interest in the subject. And my interest stemmed from a few things, not least the fact that I served in the Royal Air Force Police for 6 years between 1983 and 1989. And for 3 of those years, I was guarding tactical nuclear weapons on 2 bases, RAF Honington in Suffolk, and then I went out to Germany, RAF Larbruck, in what was then West Germany, which was down by Venlo on the Dutch border, very southern tip of Germany, West Germany then. And so I did essentially the same job that the US Air Force police security officers did that are involved in the RFI. So I kind of suspected there were far more witnesses involved, and that's how I suggested to the producers of the UFO Hunters show that it might be an idea if I was to be invited to the film shoot, so I could meet Charles Halt and ask him some questions about our mutual backgrounds, as it were. And that's how I got on the show. And that led me to have a 7-year collaboration period with Colonel Halt, which ended in late 2014 when I ended that process. And I ended the process because by then I realized that he knew more than he was telling me.
Yeah.
And that was a frustration because our agreement at the start was, tell me everything, and he said he would. But over time, I felt that he was withholding stuff, and that was one of the primary reasons why I ended that relationship.
Yeah, we'll come back to
come back to that. Yeah,
Charles Halt, of course, because he has an important role in this story. And,
he does a massive role.
Yeah, and he was the deputy base commander at the time, wasn't he? Yeah. So just to back up a little bit here, for the audience, for those among the audience who don't know very much about this incident, and I was fairly unfamiliar with it before I met you. Actually, I mean, there was some bells ringing. I had heard some.
Yeah, you'll have heard of it, but you probably didn't know what was involved.
No, I didn't connect it with other parts of it that also took place at the same time, actually. But so a quick summary: these events this is all about, they happened back in December of 1980, and on two bases, or between two Air Force bases in Suffolk in eastern England. So if you just give a brief summary about this incident, or the incidents plural.
Yeah, basically, the case is regarded as the second most important after Roswell. I would debate maybe it's more important. But historically, Roswell, I think, is number one and will stay number one. But the twin bases of RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters were leased from the Royal Air Force. So they became leased to the US Air Force. And 12,000 personnel were on the twin bases. And basically, it was the top strike base. And what I mean by strike is the response to any Soviet aggression. So if for example, there'd have been a Third World War scenario and the tanks had come rolling down from the Soviet Union into Europe, then it would have been the first line base response. And whilst the authorities won't admit that it was a nuclear base armed with tactical nuclear weapons, for all those that worked there, 6, I think, of which went on the record for me, who I interviewed, military personnel, said that they were guarding tactical nuclear weapons, which would have been a response to that Soviet aggression. So it was a really strategically hugely important base. Now, what the story was prior to my reinvestigation was that a memo had been released in October. Well, it was in early April 1983 to researchers regarding alleged activity in a forest that lay between the two bases called Rendlesham Forest. So if you can imagine one base, 5 miles, and then a forest, and then another base, that's basically the link. The forest is in the middle. And in terms of worldwide coverage, it really hit the national media and world media in October 1983 with a tabloid headline, UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official. And so that's when it went kind of viral back in 1983. And with that was this inclusion and reference to this document that's called the Halt Memorandum. Halt being the name for the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Charles Halt, who was the Deputy Base Commander at that time. He retired as a full colonel. And in that memorandum, in that big tabloid headline, it made reference, and it was a US Air Force document, it made reference to the fact that there'd been 2 nights of UFO activity. On one night, there'd been a landed triangular craft seen in a clearing, approximately 3 meters by 3 meters, with no obvious means of propulsion, engines or anything. It looked like glass, felt warm to the touch, and it had various symbols on it. And then 2 nights later, Lieutenant Charles Halt, the then Deputy Base Commander, he then admitted that he'd gone out 2 nights later and seen multiple UFOs himself, which for somebody of his rank is extremely unusual. So that's why it's a highly regarded document, because there's not many officers of that rank who will admit to seeing multiple UFOs, because they obviously felt it would be bad for their careers, etc., etc. So that's kind of where we were at. And then in 2017, I was approached to get involved in a documentary called Capel Green about Rendlesham Forest. And I was going to be the lead researcher. And I thought, well, if I'm going to put my name to this, I best do a deep dive and see if there's anything I've missed. And it's only when I did that that I realized that actually there was more than I realized, especially in terms of old interviews that were largely forgotten about, that had only appeared in minor UFO publications. And of course, when you're talking the early 80s, when some of these interviews that were done, there were no big glossy magazines then. It tended to be small, duplicated little booklets put together. So in terms of glossy magazines, it didn't really exist. It was really the late 1980s and the 90s when the glossy UFO kind of publications took off. So when I went back to day one, as it were, after the event, I then set about looking for what I thought information that I'd never heard in any UFO documentary made about the RFI, the Rendlesham Forest Incident. And that was my big criteria. Is I was pretty much of the opinion that a lot of the good stuff had not really been shown accurately on television, because television makes entertainment and it doesn't necessarily give you all the information. It doesn't lie to you directly to your face. It does it by omission. It just doesn't give you all the information on which you can make your decision or assessment. So that was going into it, and then I realized that there was lots of historical interviews where I think certain witnesses had said things that were important and yet had never featured in any of these documentaries. So I didn't initially decide to write the book until about 3 years ago, and it was because the film documentary had expanded so much, and we had over 65 hours of material plus special effects plus footage. We had something like 55 people interviewed. It became a mammoth project, and the huge post-production was taking forever. So I basically, it was my then wife who said to me, well, with all these delays and you don't know when the documentary's coming out, you've got that much information. Why don't you write a book? And I'd never written a book, albeit I'm the magazine editor, but it's a different format, totally. A magazine and writing the odd article is totally different from writing a book, different medium. Yeah. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, I have got that much information. It would never appear in the documentary because there's simply too much of it. You just don't have the time. So I then thought about, well, I think I spent about 6 months working out how to write the book, because it was such a big, sprawling story with events that had covered 3, possibly 4 successive nights in late December. There were many, many people involved, lots of moving parts, a lot of political infighting between witnesses. Politically, it looked like governments and the media had deliberately played it down. So how was I going to write this book? And so I spent a long time thinking about the format, and I basically came up with a 3-part strategy. Pre-2017, this is the story. Talking to the witnesses that I'd often gone back to, and with my advanced police training as an advanced interviewer in suspects and witnesses, I was able to elicit more information through using techniques that I'd learned. And then the last part is really 2017 onwards and what we got now, and conclusions. And so once I realized that, and for the people for the listeners who aren't aware of me, I had not only been in the Royal Air Force Police for 6 years, I then went on to have a 24-year career in the British Transport Police, so a regular police officer. But the last 19 years of my police service was as a detective constable, which is not a high rank. And I didn't want to go higher, because if you go higher than a detective sergeant, you're basically tied to a desk. And I liked interviewing. That was my specialist thing. So I was an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses and that was qualified to murder, manslaughter, rape. So I like being at the sharp end. And in any major inquiry, it's the detective constables that really do the work and then take it to the senior officers. Yeah. And they do all the interviewing. It's not like you see on TV where a superintendent sits down with a suspect. They don't have a clue about interviewing at that stage. Obviously, interviewing techniques are evolving, and the vast majority of them would not get anywhere near a real interview. They'd be live streaming it and they'd be watching from afar.
And this skill of yours has been so excellent in this book, and it really shows that. I mean,
well, that's what I. Well, thank you. That's what I was going to say. Is that when I decided to write the book, and I spoke with a number of researchers, friends that that I respect, and they said just write it from a police perspective, like you're giving evidence to a court on the facts and the facts only. Take out sentiment and people that you know and whatever as much as you can, and just look at the facts. So that's what I did, and that cemented the approach. A 3-part strategy, but it was just going to be the facts. And I think at the beginning of the book, I started with a quote by Trey Gowdy, who was a former Republican congressman, and he basically just says facts are not either Democrat or Republican; they're just the facts. We're going to go follow the facts, and that's what I've done. And if you have picked up on that, and like that, as many other of the researchers that are now commenting on the book, they've all said the same thing, and it apparently enhances the book a lot, because
yes, it does, and not least
evidential.
The way you ask questions, you ask open questions more than closed questions, and you point that out at some point in the book as well. I mean, there were some interviews before with witnesses that were very many leading questions, and that's not good if you want to have people tell the whole truth. You need to
that shows the style of change of interviewing processes, because when you look back, I can think exactly of a couple of interviews that were done. The main one being with a guy called Greg Batterham and Adrian Bustinza, done in 1984 by a Connecticut police officer called who basically, Larry Fawcett, who basically, the style then was a bit like Kojak. Tell me this, I did this, you did this, you did this. And I'm thinking, whoa, you're just leading him. He said that, and you said that, and he said that. Yeah. And that was completely different to my training. But that was the style of the time. And so it's not a criticism of him. It's just how interviewing has evolved. Yeah.
Okay, so now let's dive into the subject matter itself here. And it's big. We'll see how far we can get here. But there are accounts of not only strange lights and fast-moving objects, which are pretty common. I mean, those it's not uncommon that people see strange objects, fast-moving objects, and strange lights and things. But you have also 2 or 3 encounters with actual crafts, and even 1 or 2 encounters, maybe even more, with beings, right? And by many people.
Yes. Well, there are many people there, but few have gone on the record.
Yeah, but I mean, theoretically, there could be
15, 20. Well, I think when you're dealing with incidents that have happened, not just in the forest, and this is the misnomer, is that when I broke the incidents down, they weren't just happening on the base, happening in the forest. There were some over the bases that weren't recognised, and there was also, I think, what was interesting is there were what was called 3 precursor cases that took place earlier in 1980 that set the foundation. There was February, July, and November before the cluster of sightings at late December 1980, and I think they play an important part of setting the scene, and also from detracting away from the ludicrous explanation that's been offered for all these years, 40-odd years, which they were all mistaken for the Orford Nest Lighthouse. Well, let me start from day one. That only got any traction because the media, the British media, the world media, endorsed it and gave it airtime. And all the documentaries that followed still talk about, were they deceived by the lights of the lighthouse? Well, it was ridiculous from day one. And actually, none of the witnesses had ever said it was the lighthouse. And in fact, when some of them were later interrogated and they tried to say, "Oh, you saw the lighthouse," they would say, "No, I didn't see the lighthouse." And they were vehemently against the lighthouse theory. But it was given oxygen by the media. And your only conclusion there can be is that the media at the very highest levels, I think, were told to play this case down because of the potential gravitas to change people's opinions. If all of this information that was in the book had come out then, you may well have been talking about a UFO disclosure 40 years ago, in my opinion. It would have been an overwhelming clamour for further investigations, and documentaries would have been totally different from the way they've been. So I think there was a very deliberate decision early on by the US Air Force, probably endorsed by the US government, actively with the British government, British Ministry of Defence, to play it down right from the off. And unfortunately, they've done a very good job in muddying the waters. But a hugely complex case. And it's only when you step away from it and do it factually that you can actually make the case more easily. I mean, you've just read the book. You tell me, do you think there's a case for saying that a lot more information should have come out between now and then, and TV documentaries should have covered a lot more things?
Oh, yes. Definitely. It's actually a bit shocking to but I mean, maybe it's like this every time. It's just that people aren't as meticulous as you have been when they dive into things to check what actually happened.
Well, that's kind of you to say that, and some of the senior researchers who I've got reviews of have actually more or less just said what you've said, that in a sense sterile detective reinvestigation and evaluating every little interview and things like that and picking out the key points, etc., seems to be popular with my audience, shall we say. So that's good. That it shows that I've done the right approach. And whilst it may have taken 6 months to come to that conclusion, it was well worth it to come to the right conclusion if it's the approach that people like. And I think one of the things that has surprised me with people that's just read it, who bought the book, is that they say it's a bit like a thriller. They can't put it down.
Yeah.
And for what is a reinvestigation of just a factual event, I'm surprised by that, but I'm obviously pleased by that. But they were saying I couldn't put it down, and it's like a thriller, and I never meant it like that.
It's true. It's a thriller without the the fancy bits like in Hollywood scripts and things like that. But reality is more thrilling than fiction many times.
Well, you talked earlier on about the different things that are seen, and the whole gamut. And I think one of the things that had never been done before, and could have been done, because I'm not rocket science, I'm not no massive brain, but somebody else could have done this over the last 40 years. They could have taken the time to really do an investigation, break it down. And when I broke it down, if there's a gap between an incident, time-wise, say of 20 minutes, half an hour, and then something else happens, that's a different incident. It may well all be on the same night, but if it's a different incident with a time gap in a different location, that's a different event with different witnesses usually. And that's what you get with Rendlesham. So in the book, it highlights at the end that there were 18 separate incidents over a 3, potentially 4-day period in late December. Now, there's an update from that, Anders, that the chapter 20 was new information by a guy called James Stewart. And it's an incredible testimony. However, since the release of the book, he's come back to me and said, I've been checking my personnel records, his evaluation records, because he wasn't a US Air Force security policeman. He was what was called a crew chief. He was somebody that repaired aircraft. And he had an incredible incident. But he said, actually, I was posted off the base on the 6th of January, 1980. So my incident wasn't December 1980. It was December 1979. Which takes him away from the late December, but then throws up this huge conundrum now that there was a very similar incident involving what appears to be entities, shots fired by a US Air Force security guard, physical marks on the canopy of a screen, and a UFO seen landing near some trees.
So this is the incident when he was repairing a plane, and he
yes,
could
that's
see,
right. But that's now
he
December.
heard something walking on the plane, and he saw footsteps, and there was something.
That's now December 79.
That's the year before. Oh,
year before. So then, actually, in the same way that you think, oh well, it's taken one off from the main sightings, it then throws up all these questions. Well, they came back a year later to the same time frame after this, and so I'm now trying to get more information from there's like a Woodbridge and Bentwaters community of ex-servicemen, so I'm trying to make inroads into that now and see if anybody can throw any light on this, because the guy is a genuine witness. I have no doubt he's telling me the truth, but he said, I'm genuinely mistaken. I thought it was the 6th of January. And he just assumed, as you would, that his was part of the series of incidents. Because what's the odds of there being another series of incidents a year earlier? But he said, when I actually checked my evaluation records, so it's 17 separate incidents now for the late December cluster, and this new December 79 that nobody's ever talked about, but has huge implications. So that
sounds like there's an update coming, or a sequel, maybe.
Well, people keep saying they can write book 2, but it took me 3 years to write book 1.
Another 3 years. Come on.
But I mean, you going back to that, what you said, you are looking in those 17 different incidents. You are looking from structured triangular craft, 3 meters by 3 meters, that was like diamond shaped, well, triangular, but it had like a raised piece in the middle, like a cockpit section that went to a height of 2 meters. There was no windows, no propulsion. It was like black glass. When you touched it, it was warm to the touch. And there were some etchings, like glass etchings to the touch. It felt like a glass etching, like you get on the windscreen of a vehicle. So there was that, but no entity seen, and it was emitting lights from within, but no noise or anything. You go from, often that's been seen, as small spheres, including like a beach ball sized red, orange, glowing object that's operating under control, stopping, starting, motionless, and then zigzagging around in the sky. So you've got different witnesses seeing that, to seeing white spheres the size of a car, to seeing bigger objects, bigger triangular objects. You have got then the entity question that you talked about. There are at least 2 occasions where entities are seen, one of which is
including the James Stewart episode.
Well, no, taking that out. No, taking the James Stewart out now, because that's now December 79. So in the late December period, of those 17 that are left, you've got 2 separate entity scenarios, and they both involved Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who is this key witness. And in the book, if you look, his chapter, I think, is something like 80-odd pages. It's
it's big.
Chapter. And the reason why there is so much time given to him is because he is what I regard as the key linking witness. And what do I mean by that? He links events that Colonel Halt is alleged to have been involved more than what is already disclosed. Halt will admit to being involved in one night of activity, but Sergeant Adrian Bustinza's testimony points to and names him as being involved in a second night of activity, where there's a second landing, where entities are seen, that it's being filmed, that there are 15 to 20 security police officers surrounding this second landing object, and that whilst it's being filmed, the base commander, Colonel Gordon Williams, the guy in charge of 12,000 personnel, is there. And he kind of has this silent face-off with some entities, which sounds just like science fiction, or a bit like Close Encounters.
Yeah. Now, let's just
we've got
go into the details of the the juicy parts that I think the listeners are interested in. The crafts. You've been talking about the first triangular-shaped craft that Jim Penniston
and
John Burroughs probably saw. on the first night, and then this third night, the so-called Halt night, is when there supposedly was a larger craft landing on the Capel Green field. Is that right?
Well, no. The Halt night basically this is I think cause for confusion.
Yeah, I'm confused
somewhat by this is why it's complicated. I'll go through the 4 nights basically. The first night is what's called the landed triangular craft, a structured craft in a clearing in the forest, Rendlesham Forest, seen by Jim Penniston, described as that. The person he was with, John Burroughs, never described it as a craft like Jim Penniston because he was stood further back. So his perception of what it was different. He saw a series of lights that suggested structure behind the lights. So from where he was stood back, that was his prescription. So that's night 1. Then we didn't really know what had happened on night 2. It didn't come out for many years, and it involved a shift commander called Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. I tell the story in the book, and we can come back to that. So that's the second night. And then the third night is the Halt night, where he's told the UFO's back. He's at a Christmas function. So he organizes a small team of people to go out in the forest. There's already lots of airmen there when he gets in the forest, but he says, keep back, and I'll go out with my small team. And at the same time, he does an audio recording of like a little dictaphone where he's giving updates of what is a live event, as it were. And then we have this new scenario by Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who told me in this very dramatic interview with me that was 4.5 hours, a transatlantic phone call, that he said, no, that's another night. And I said, what? He says, yeah, no, I was involved in a second night of activity, and that was another night when the landed craft was. So that's potentially this fourth night. But within that, there are lots of other little events that have been going on and that people have got involved in. But essentially, the two that involve entities that involve Adrian Bustinza is that Halt's team, let's go to the third night, Halt's gone out with his small team. And here's the thing, Adrian Bustinza was a part of that 5-person team. So there was Halt plus 4 others. Bustinza was one of them. They go out for 4.5 hours, as the existing story goes. They then go back to where all the vehicles were, which was called the staging area. And there's a guy there, Jim Penniston, who was there involved in the first night, and he's had a feeling that something's going on. He's come in from Ipswich, he's got a lift to the base, and he's saying, I want to go out there. Something feels compel me to go out there. So eventually, when Halt and his team come back, along with Bustinza, John Burroughs says to Halt, can I go out there? Cutting a long story short, he says, yeah, okay, you can go out there. So off he goes with Adrian Bustinza. John Burroughs says, Sarge, will you come with me? So those two go back out into the forest, and we're not quite sure where the location is. It's not in the farmer's field. It's close to it, but it's not quite in the field. And then they have an encounter. Listen to this. And this was the new testimony as described in detail to me in this long phone call. And he basically said that they're going back into the forest, and he said Adrian Bustinza felt as if something pushed him to the ground. He felt a force from behind, not that he saw anything, and he fell to the ground. And as he fell forward, John Burroughs was ahead of him a few meters. And then suddenly John Burroughs is engulfed in an incredibly bright white light. Now, part of the white light touches Adrian Bustinza on his hand and his groin. And ever since, he's had rashes, unknown rashes in that area ever since. So he was touched by the light. Now, when he's looking forward, he sees John Burroughs. Imagine a blinding light, and you're trying to focus, and it's I guess like looking at the sun. You can't do it. You kind of like using your peripherals. But he said when he looked forward into this bright white light, he saw John in the middle, and on the left of him, he said that there was some kind of outline of someone else. And then on the right side of John in the middle was something else as well. So in a sense, some kind of life form on either side of John, until the light blinked off, and that was it. And then they go back to the staging area. Now, here's the interesting thing. They only thought they were gone 10 minutes whilst this event happened. When they got back, Charles Halt the deputy base commander, is like, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" Well, we've only been gone 10 minutes. According to Halt, they've been gone about 40 minutes, which suggests this missing time factor of some interaction with
Perhaps
something else.
They've
been abducted. In simple terms, they may have been abducted. There's a time difference.
But do you qualify this event as an event of
that would be a close encounter?
Beings.
Yes, because he'd seen them at close proximity, i.e. within meters, 10, 15 meters. Yeah. This is a close proximity, close encounter. Now, the other thing that then Adrian Bustinza said in that unique interview with me, and he'd never been interviewed like that before, was that he said that he'd been involved in this second landing, and it was on another night. And I was really taken by surprise.
This is really mind-blowing, the fourth night.
And he basically says that he then corroborated the account given by the original military whistleblower, an airman called Larry Warren, really controversially been attacked. No, your account don't match with anybody else's. But when Adrian Bustinza, who had said things over many years privately on social media, but he'd never gone public, he'd never done an article, he'd never been on TV, never been involved in a documentary, very, very reluctant witness to speak. So it was a real privilege to eventually persuade him or get the opportunity to speak to him. And what he basically said was, on this other night, Larry Warren was definitely involved because he was in front of me and they asked him to go closer to the craft because there's this ring of security police officers around this second craft, which they described as being like a shimmering, translucent craft that you couldn't look direct. You had to keep looking at it through your peripheral because it would distort. But he said that Larry Warren was a part of this cordon around this craft and that somebody asked Warren to go forward. And so you may be 20, Bustinza is maybe only 20 feet from this object, but Larry Warren was like 10 feet from this object. So he finally confirmed that Warren was there, which has been a big source of debate and bitterness. But he corroborated it. And not only did he do so, he said, yeah, it was being filmed, basically with cameras, not still cameras. So can you imagine? They've set up cameras, so they kind of must think it's coming back. But then that kind of has a link now to maybe the December 79 incident with James Stewart. You never think of it that way, but maybe they did expect something to come back.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got it's being filmed. There are other security police officers around this who never come forward. And that he confirms, Adrian Bustinza, that the base commander of 12,000 people, Colonel Gordon Williams, who always denied being present, was there. So it corroborated Warren more or less 100%. And finally, you've got two people who are involved in this second landing. But he also says that Colonel Halt was there. And Halt has totally denied ever being involved in the second incident, totally denies that Colonel Williams was there, totally denied any talk of aliens, entities, or anything. That's a load of rubbish. But as you can see from one of the chapters when I talk about Halt, there's actually a link to that landing because in 1985, two MUFON, Mutual UFO Network in America, investigators, Ray Boucher and Scott Colburn, were doing inquiries into Rendlesham Forest for about 3 years. And in the process of doing that, Ray Boucher, this MUFON investigator, had called Halt in 1985, April 1985, and over the phone, he'd said, well, I've talked to Larry Warren, I've talked to Adrian Bustinza, talked to a number of people, there's a landed craft, it's surrounded by security police officers, there's the base commander there, Colonel Williams, and it's being filmed. And what Halt said verbatim to Ray Boucher in 1985 was, yes, I can verify that, I can substantiate all of that for the senator. And he was talking about Senator James Exton. So this is, from my point of view, as an advanced interviewer, this is a clear admission that this incident, this other landing did take place. And it now ties in. So we've got two people, two airmen, Sergeant Bustinza and Airman Larry Warren, now tying in with this reference and admission made to Ray Boucher in 1985. And then you get an actual further confirmation when a guy called Captain Mike Verano, who's only ever gone public twice with comments. One in the CNN documentary in 1985, where he's in blackout, but it says Officer V. Basically, Mike Verano, he basically says, I picked up the base commander and drove him to a waiting jet aircraft, and he was carrying like a satchel, a top secret satchel, and Mike Verano said to the base commander, Colonel Williams, what's in the satchel? And he said, it's film, motion picture footage. So again, a reference. He took him from the landing site, Colonel Williams, who was never supposed to be there. Plus he's got this film, and he's took him to a waiting fighter aircraft that takes off. So it all ties in nicely.
Absolutely fascinating. There are many names here, of course, and I recognize
it's difficult.
All the names, but for the listeners, it's complicated. But you have to mention the names. I know that. But before we dive a little bit deeper into the witnesses here and some people, some particular names, on this fourth night and this spectacular, fascinating landing where apparently a lot of people were standing around, policemen and the base commander and everybody on that craft. There were beings, right? And they have been described as if they were kind of repairing the craft or something like that. And there are also, which I found very fascinating towards the end of the book, you mention a number of, or at least a couple of civilian witnesses who have also seen something on that field to the effect of, a strange craft with beings on top of it, looking like children in snow suits or something like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the details around that craft?
Okay, well, militarily, from military witnesses, the story goes with the entities from, as described by Bustinza and Larry Warren. Bustinza describes seeing what he regards as silhouettes of life forms. He's not really comfortable about talking about entities as in aliens or whatever, because he was very religious. It really messed him up, his faith and thought on life and etc. It was very difficult for him to accept what he'd seen. The real story of the aliens in more detail was from the original military whistleblower, Larry Warren, who basically said that there is this translucent, he said, like diamond-shaped craft, and he said what happened when he was there is a bubble. That's all the way he can describe it. There's no windows, there's no doors, nothing opens. Literally, a bubble slips off the side of the craft, separates from the side of the craft, floating in the air, 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and then the bubble divides into 3 separate bubbles. 1, 2, 3. And within each of the bubbles was the upper torso of a humanoid figure, wearing some kind of upper clothing, very pale, very thin faces, kind of what you would say is a typical grey alien, big eyes, and basically they are hovering there. There's no speech of any kind, but the base commander is apparently 5-10 feet away, well, I'm going to say 10 feet away from these 3 entities. So there's this face-off where they're looking at each other. There's nothing spoken, but it's like there's maybe some kind of telepathic communication going on. And of course, we'll never know now because Colonel Williams has passed away. He finished as a 2-star general. But we have this incredible close encounter visual at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the entity comes out and there's the waving at each other and they're doing the signs. You've kind of got that scenario, but this is a base commander and it's happening for real. Base commander of 12,000 people with a face-to-face with 3 silent floating entities beside a translucent shimmering craft that is then surrounded and being filmed. Well, I believe that film of motion picture footage exists somewhere, and probably still does, but it's highly unlikely we'll ever get to see it. But is there evidence to suggest that that really happened, that scenario? Yes, now we have Bustinza's corroborated testimony to Larry Warren. We've got the link to Mike Verano regarding the motion picture footage, and we've got the admission by Halt to Ray Boucher that this incident was filmed, base commander was there, and there was a second landing. It points to the fact that something happened militarily that was there. Now, would they want to play that down? Well, you think about it. Would, in 1980, the American government, the British government, face off with three floating entities of unknown origin? Would they want that coming out? And the answer is close to not, especially after America had closed their interest in the subject allegedly in 1969 with the closure of Project Blue Book. So they weren't in the UFO business. So this would totally contradict. Plus, it would have been a game changer. And can you imagine if this film had got out? Then we wouldn't be having this discussion.
I think Steven Spielberg has it. He bought it probably.
Well, if he does, I'd like to have him put it out there. But anyway, so you've got that from military witnesses, and you mentioned civilians. Now, there was in the book, there's a chapter devoted to, are there any incidents that talk about this field kind of event, this second landing field event? And I come up with 15 accounts, some of which are more than just hearsay, but nevertheless, they're from independent sources. They're a story. And like you said, one of the original stories of the children in the snow white bunny suits, and an incident going in the field was down to a lady called Dot Street. Dot Street was one of the two housewives, original civilian investigators of Rendlesham, who became aware that something had happened in the forest because they were given a tip-off within days of the events happening. So we're talking early January. They're kind of being told, or late December, early January, they're being told that something's gone on. So they start making inquiries. And during the course of that time, they'd knocked on doors, knocked on farmhouses nearby, and they'd all been kind of rejected. Then many years later, when a little girl that she'd seen on knocking on the door of one of the houses close to the field that were adjacent to it, at the time, there was a little girl there, but the father basically said, no, didn't see anything. And she didn't get a chance to speak with the little girl, who was maybe 6, 7, 8 years old at the time. Well, many years later, when this child has now grown up into her 30s, early 30s, Dot Street, who was quite well known within the UFO fraternity because of her work on Rendlesham Forest, she's at a function when this girl approaches and she said, you don't recognize me, but I was the little girl, and when you knocked on the door of the house and spoke to my father, he wouldn't allow me to say anything, but I'd seen something. And what the story goes is that she's up in her bedroom and she looks out of a bedroom window that looked down onto the farmer's field where this other landing took place, and she sees these small children-like figures, pale, like in the snowsuits, like children's snowsuits, small. And she is so transfixed by this, she keeps shouting down to her grandfather, Grandad, Grandad, come up here, basically. And he's just said, no, go to bed, stay, keep quiet. But eventually she goes on so much that he comes up, and when he looks out of the window, having explained what she'd seen, he too sees these children in bunny suits, and he is frightened. He's disturbed by it. And he basically said, you're not to talk to this ever again. Yeah. So in a sense, why is Dot Street going to make up this story? She's a respected researcher. Why is she going to make up this story? So she knows the identity of this girl, but the girl does not want to go public. So she said, I'll respect your opinion. But she's related the story back. So I can understand that. Lots of people in this field are very reluctant to ever go on camera for fear of ridicule or risk to their careers, etc. It can do that. Although the stigma now is receding because the circumstances are changing in America, there's still a long way to go. So that's again another direct reference. And one of my favorite civilian stories that point to this field event as really happening is a guy called Gary Collins, who I tried to trace. He used to live very close to the field in the next village called Capel St Andrew, but he'd moved, and I have not been able to find him. So if he's out there and listening, if you're still alive, please come contact me. But basically, he tells a story that was first mentioned in a very good book called You Can't Tell the People by Georgina Bruni that came out in I think 2000. And that was really the best summary of the case after 20 years. So it was a good book, and she delved into and got a lot of new testimonies. It's well worth getting. So in a sense, it's similar to the book now that I've done, but that was done at 20 years. Okay? But she didn't have my background in interviewing skills. But she was not a researcher. She went into it as a civilian. She was known for journalism, but not in the UFO field. And she did a very good book. And she talks to a guy called Gary Collins, this person I've just referred to. And he says that he used to have friends on the base. Now, when you've got a big base like that, they've got bowling alleys and things like that. People would often work on the bases who were local, just doing various bits of electrician stuff and whatever. And he was one of those. And he had some friends who were US Air Force security police, and they used to go to this pub and just socialize. Well, one day he's with, I think he says, 4 other US Air Force security police officers when they're in the pub, and they kind of got some alert. So it must have been an early kind of pager that said they had to return back to the base. And he didn't know what it was, but they all left. And then a couple of days later, he saw one of them again. And he related this story, and he said that this guy, this security police officer, had been a dog handler. He said, my dog, we were taken out into the forest, we didn't know what it was, my dog refused to get out, but I was told to then join other security police officers and go out in and follow them into the forest. And he said, then they come across this landed craft surrounded by security police officers, and there was some kind of an event there in this field. And that's a great reference. And that's a civilian. It's totally nothing to do. So how is that story going to be made up? It's not. It's totally independent. And I think there's some great credence to that. And plus he also, in the days afterwards, had driven by and said that he'd had a sighting of a triangular object, or a craft, a structured craft, over the forest, close to where the incident took place, on what was a public road that ran at the back of RAF Bentwater's, RAF Woodbridge back gate, and then across from this public road was the forest. So he said he saw an object there, and he also said that he saw British police officers alongside US security police officers stopping people going into the forest, and it was a public area. People, were being stopped, and they were being told basically there's some incident, there's a downed aircraft or whatever. So there was some kind of activity which has been denied by the US Air Force. And
when you have all these accounts, it's really, it's really so compelling when you compile it together. It is.
Oh, it is, and the fact that it's all now broken down, and we've got all these different incidents. I think it was ludicrous right from the day one to ever suggest the lighthouse. But now there is absolutely no reason after this book why anybody should ever talk about lighthouse making documentaries going forward. And that the existing narrative as it's been played out for the last 25 years has literally been wrong, in my opinion. And I'm trying to speak to, as I relate in the book, there's other interviews by airmen who have had lesser involvement, but nevertheless their parts should have equal value because they're all involved in these strange things. And one thing that we're not even talking about yet, because it's such a complicated, meaty case, is the interrogations.
Yeah,
that some of the men were in.
I'm planning on asking about that as well. But
okay. I'll let you go. You ask away.
But first, what are your thoughts on the questionable approach by the star witness? You have to call him the star witness, Charles Halt. Who was the one who released the famous Halt memo, which gave the whole thing publicity. And he was undoubtedly, as far as I understand, the only official person to confirm UFO activity. But then after that, he has been contradicting himself. He has been apparently almost lying, as far as one can tell. Why do you think he's done all this? Has he had an agenda? Has been controlled from higher levels? What's the story around Halt?
Well, I kind of had this 7-year collaboration period with him, between 2007 and 2014. And at the start, I'd said the reason why we had a collaboration was that I'd always thought that at some point the Rendlesham Forest story will be made into a big feature film because it's such a good story. And Roswell was made into a TV movie. And so I said, would you help me collaborate on writing a film script? I like writing amateur film scripts. So I wanted to try to do this. And because I knew a lot about the case, I thought, well, maybe if he works with me and he can help me to get it forward, there's a chance it could be sold. Because I do think it's destined to be made into a movie. So that was the basis around where we got together. And I also said to him, I need you to be completely honest with me. And he knew what I did in my background, and I was still a serving detective at the time. And he said, "Yeah, I'll tell you everything and whatever." So I had no reason not to believe him at first. And it was only over a period of time that there were a few little chinks that came out, and one of them was I said to him right at the start, "I'm going to go away now for 4 months and study everything I can find, and then come back to you and start asking you questions." He said, "Yeah, that's fine." So I came back to him 4 months later, and I said, "Who's the fifth person in your team?" And he went, "Well, there was Robert Ball, there was Lieutenant England, Munro Neville's, myself, and I can't remember the other one." And I said, "It's Adrian Bustinza because he's on the audio tape." "Oh, yeah, Adrian Bustinza." And you're like, he was playing it down. That's the distinct impression. He was playing it down. I'm thinking, why is he playing it down? So I kind of let it go. And then over a period of time, it was fine for a long time. And then in early 2014, I think it was, he sent me an email saying, "Oh, I've got some real new information from a source." He didn't disclose who the source was, but I'm finally going to be able to discredit Larry Warren, the original military whistleblower who talked about this second landing and with entities being seen. And he'd always had a real downer on him. Now, I'd met Larry Warren a few times just at conferences and things like that. Didn't consider him a friend as such, but I'd met him and he was fine, and we spoke, and he came across to me fine. And I'd always I knew of his story, and I always, when I've talked to him and heard other people asking questions, he was like that. His responses were purely natural, and it was as if he's speaking with a genuine recall. And that's what I always thought, that I was a genuine witness. Well, he then said, Colonel Halt said in this email, I've got a source that's going to destroy basically Larry Warren. And I'm thinking, well, okay, if you've got evidence, that's fine. Evidence falls where it falls. But if you're going to slander somebody, you've got to then produce that evidence, else it's slander. You can't just say you're a con man or a fraud or whatever unless you've got evidence to back that up. And if you've got evidence, fine, put it out there, because that's the facts. But the trouble is, when he did this, he didn't produce any evidence. And by then, I'd realized that he had a real downer on Larry Warren and this alien story. And over the course of my reinvestigation, this kind of, why has he got such a downer? And then I realized that the downer was because Adrian Bustinza would link him to this second landing, because Bustinza says Halt's involved in this second landing. Well, Halt's denied that. So, of course, he never really wanted to ever admit that Bustinza was with his team. He never mentions him in that sense. That's why he was reluctant, in my opinion.
But why? I mean, basically, why philosophically? Why would he not want to reveal that? I mean, he revealed
because he didn't want to reveal that the base commander was there talking to, effectively having a silent face-off.
So he wanted to protect Williams. That's the reason.
Yeah, protect Williams and protect the Air Force and government, I think. Okay. I think I can't prove that, but that's the logical inference, is that someone on high had told him, probably at high levels in the Air Force, "We'll leave you alone. You can talk about what's in the memo, but nothing else. Everything else you've got to criticize." But then there's the interesting factor, and we've not talked about it, is that because there are 3 chapters in the book about Halt, and because he's such an interesting character, and one of them is just his role in general and the memo and etc. But there's also one where he, I say that he tried to sell his story, and it's not something I would ever put in a book unless there was good corroboration for it. but I found 4 independent sources that said that whilst Charles Halt was still in the Air Force, he didn't retire until 1991, 92, something like that. So we're talking early 80s. Now, bear in mind that the Halt headline that came out, and the big tabloid News of the World headline, British tabloid, UFO lands in Suffolk, that's official, that came out on October the 2nd, 1983, so almost 3 years after the event. Now, the author of that article, for that headline, was a reporter called Keith Beebe from News of the World. Now, it turns out from 4 independent sources, 2 of which saw material directly related to that offer, that confirmed that Colonel Halt, while he was still in the Air Force in early 1983, prior to the big headline, was in communication with Keith Beebe, apparently working on a deal to sell his story to the paper for X amount. We don't know the amount, but apparently a lot of money. Now, this is incredible because this is then a lieutenant colonel, so deputy base commander, who was willing in early 1983 to sell his story. And there are 4 independent sources that corroborate that. Now, if you're a journalist, most would go with at least 2 sources before they said anything, but usually 3. Well, now I've got 4. So I'm thinking I'm going to put this in the book because I think the public should know this. And the 4 are all independent, and they tell the story that he was willing to sell the story. And the best one of the 4 in terms of authenticity, shall we say, that just rings right, is a British astronomer called Ian Ridpath, who was basically a skeptic. And he was the person who put forward the lighthouse theory essentially to dumb it down, and that was adopted by the media and the like. And he admitted in a letter that's in in a small UFO journal, he makes direct reference to, yeah, I was present when Colonel Halt gave a lecture, when Keith Beebe, the reporter who for the News of the World, disclosed that Halt was prepared to sell his story. So this is from a skeptic. It's not even a UFO biased kind of person, a believer, as it were. And so that when I read that, I thought, wow, this is a real, genuine story. So you think about Halt's perspective in all of this is that in early 1983, 4 independent witnesses basically say that he was prepared to sell his story. He'd apparently told Keith Beebe he couldn't release the story until after he was out of the Air Force, which was at least, I think, 8 years afterwards. So in 1991, I think he retired. Now, in the meantime, Warren had come forward, the original military whistleblower, and had gone to Larry Fawcett, the Connecticut police officer who was this kind of very forceful interviewer at the time. He was involved with a guy called Barry Greenwood, and they wrote a book called Clear Intent. And they wrote a chapter in that book. It was all about UFO cover-ups, basically, but with very evidential related material. And Larry Warren had gone to them, and they'd included one chapter of their book, Clear Intent, about this alleged incident in Rendlesham Forest. It was really the first time in a big book, an important book, that the case had been mentioned. And in that, obviously, Warren had said that he'd seen entities, blah, 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 that kind of thing. So it was a real good story. But the case had not been viewed in the right way. It was, in a sense, the Clear Intent was lost because it was new and they didn't really realize what was happening. But essentially, the 1983 story of Halt wanting to sell his story is essential to how we look at Halt now. Because if you think about it, it changes the way you look at Halt. And then you realize that in 1985, he'd made an admission saying, yeah, it was being filmed. And that admission is good. It was written down verbatim. And in subsequent letters that Ray Boucher wrote to Senator James Exxon, who was trying to get interested in the case, he laid it out very clearly, openly. And a couple of letters are included in the images at the back of the book, where he clearly lays out that motion picture footage was taken, that the base commander was there, and it was all filmed, etc. And Halt had said verbatim, I can verify all of that. I can substantiate all of that for the centre. So we've got this great admission. And so this is while he's still in the Air Force. You've got the 1983 trying to sell his story, and then in 1985 he's admitting to Ray Boucher that, yeah, it's a real incident second thing. After that, he denies everything.
Yeah.
So from 1985 onwards, he denies everything. And I think that at some point he was told, you can talk about what's in the memo, nothing else, because that's out there. We can't deny it.
Yeah, that was the frame for the whole story.
But you can't admit to anything else. Yeah. And I think that was what he was told.
Why do you think Larry Warren has been so condescendingly treated? I mean, was he targeted because he was considered a loose cannon and could easily be disregarded, or what was it?
Larry Warren had only just joined the Air Force, and his first overseas posting was to Bentwater and Woodbridge. He'd only been on shift 3 or 4 shifts. He was so new from his training. His training was rushed through. And he got on shift, apparently because there was some shortage of men. And he got on shift earlier than he should have done, as others were, including a guy called Airman Steve Longero. And Steve Longero plays an important part in the Warren story because Steve Longero had been on the same training course with him at Lackland Air Force Base. So they'd done the same training together. Now, this is important because they arrived within a couple of days of each other. They'd been on the same training course. And on the night that Warren is out there, the other person that corroborates Warren being directly involved in one of the nights of activity in the forest at the time of these incidents going on is this guy, Steve Longero, who went on to have a 30-year policing career, sheriff, Air Force career. He was a very stand-up guy. I met him. I brought him over to speak in the UK. We got a statement from him. I had a long interview with him. And he will say, well, he'd had an incident at the weapons storage area where he'd seen a beam from a UFO shining down into the nuclear weapons storage bunkers. And then the UFO moved away over to the forest. He was then taken from the weapons storage area with many others into the forest because things were developing in the forest. And he said when he's in the forest, he has another incident where there's another 10 or 15 airmen involved. And this is before Halt gets there. Right, so we're not quite sure which night we're talking about, but this would appear to be the 4th night to me because he's linking it to Warren, and Warren was only involved in 1 night, not 2 nights. So it appears to link with that. And he says, I saw Larry Warren where all the vehicles were in what was called the staging area, and he said Halt was briefing us. You go there, you go there, you go there, and he says that Halt was briefing him and Larry Warren, and they weren't mates as such, but they were on the same training course. So I can attest to this myself, that when I joined the Air Force, in my intake flight, my class, there were like 47. I would know all the names by the end of the training, but I wouldn't be friends with them all. I might be friends with 6 or 7 of them who were closest to me in the dormitories where we were staying, but you build your own little circle of friends. But you'd know of him and you'd certainly recognize him because he was on your course. You saw him every day during training. And he said that in the staging area, he saw Larry Warren being briefed like he was by Colonel Halt, and you go there, you go there. So in a sense, he said, I was pleased to see Larry Warren. It was a face I recognized because we'd done the training, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? This is, I've only just got on shift and I'm suddenly involved in this weird and wonderful thing. And so I think that makes perfect what's called a recognition trigger as to why he would remember somebody and have a specific hardened memory ingrained into his memory because they'd been on the same training, and he's thinking, oh, he's there, at least he's going through what I'm going through. Oh, I'm keeping my head down. And that makes perfect psychological sense as to why he would be very specific. And going back to what you said about why Warren was demonized, well, he wasn't demonized at first. For the first 8 years after he went public and essentially put his name on camera in late 1983, by the time he'd done that, he was on his own, Warren, publicly for about 8 years, until about 1991. But as soon as Halt retired, as soon as Jim Penniston retired, as soon as John Burroughs retired, then all 3 of them, who were involved in the memorandum, if you think about it, They all then said, "Oh well, we don't, the testimony about aliens is a load of rubbish. It doesn't match any of our recollections." And they started to get critical of him, which then gained traction. And then in the mid 2014, 2015, this is when Colonel Halt then starts attacking Warren again. And this is what ultimately caused me to end the relationship with him, because he told me he'd got a new source. I suspected who that source was, but he never told me directly. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, you've got to produce the evidence. Otherwise, it's slander. You can't call somebody a fraud, a conman, etc., unless you've got the evidence. If you've got the evidence, put it out there. I'll back you up. But if you don't, you're being unprofessional. And what he did was he just basically tore into Warren, didn't produce any of the evidence, and I thought it was unprofessional. And it was indicative that there was some kind of agenda to dumb down, criticize, make a fool of Larry Warren, and he was joining in with that. And I thought, no, that's wrong. The evidence does support him being there, and that was subsequently borne out by the further corroboration from not only Adrian Bustinza, but with Steve Longero saying he'd seen him in the staging area. So it was groundless, but he had necessarily gone along with these people, a small group in the UK, trolls I call them, because they're just abusive. If you disagree with them, they verbally abuse you. You're effing this and you're effing that. Yeah. That's not the way to talk to people. And so he joined with them. Holt had joined with them, and I've got communications proving that. And basically, he just accepted their story, and he didn't produce any evidence. So I silently stopped all communication with Holt. And that's what it is.
As you say, a connection between Penistone, Burroughs, and Halt via.
They're the ones who were critical.
The memorandum.
Yeah. So, if you remember what I'd said was, over the period of my reinvestigation, the thing that began to dawn on me was that something that Colonel Williams had said in an interview with James Fox, the documentary filmer James Fox. And I think it was for the documentary I Know What I Saw. And James Fox questions Colonel Williams. He's out of uniform. I think he'd retired by then. And I think he'd been playing golf, and he's leaning alongside of his car. And it's a very casual kind of, and he asked a few questions. And what he said about the memo, he said, well, there was a few things in the memo that we didn't, legislate for that got out, and then it kind of went away and lived a life of its own, because they couldn't deny it after that. Up until that point, until literally May of 1983, so for 2.5 years, the US Air Force had steadfastly denied any incident that took place whatsoever. And then accidentally, because of Larry Warren's involvement, the memo came out unexpectedly from a different point of origin, and it surfaced. It was never meant to go public. And of course, that document was on US headed note paper, US Air Force headed note paper, and it was just a one-page document, but it told of 2 UFO incidents, which is Halt, Penistone, and Burroughs. So what Williams said was it went away and had a life on its own. There was a few things in there that we didn't really countenance, kind of thing. So he was kind of saying, it got out and it went away and had a life on its own. There's nothing we could do about it. So we had to stick with it. We couldn't deny it. But anything else you didn't have a piece of paper for, and this is what came out to me, anything else that you didn't have any evidence for, we're going to deny, we're going to ridicule. And that's why when any new witness comes along now, they're usually attacked by Halt. First off, Steve Longero came forward, not because he was his friend and just helping his drinking buddy out, as he would say. Halt would say, oh, he's just a drinking buddy. He's just one of his friends. He's coming forward just to help his mate. Well, he wasn't like that at all. This was a really stand-up guy, but he was sick of seeing these people criticising him, and he knew he was there because he'd seen him on the night he was out and seen UFOs. So,
how old is Halt now? How old is he?
I think he's in his early 80s, 82, 83.
Okay, so maybe he won't be, it's too late to have him tell the whole story. Or who knows, maybe on his deathbed he will he will tell the whole story to somebody.
Well, he was obviously prepared to tell his story when he was still in the Air Force. That's the key thing. And so you've got to look at Halt in a slightly different way. And the fact that there was this incredible admission, written down verbatim, fully corroborated, there is no ambiguity whatsoever. It was a direct quote pertaining to the fact that there was a second landing, that it was filmed, and that Colonel Williams was there.
Yeah,
it's a huge admission, and it's lost in history. And I devote a big chapter to it because it should be for the public to see that and make their own mind up. Now, I think that's relevant. And so basically in the book, anything that I've thought you should know about, as in the reader, the public, I've put in the book if there's evidence for it. And that's what I've tried to do, is just present the evidence. And so I've gone through interviews, old and new, some really old interviews, and done the transcripts of them and evaluated them. And you realize so many inconsistencies in some of these stories that have been told. I talk about the binary codes, which Jim Penniston suddenly introduced 30 years after the event. And yet he'd found out what they were in 1994 when he'd been hypnotized. And that's where they first turned up. But he told the audience on the 30th anniversary, I didn't know what they were. Well, he did. You can't have it both ways. He did know what they were.
Well, I guess we don't have time to go into that, but that's a story in and of itself, the binary codes that Jim Penniston is talking about. But we won't go into that. There are so many ends here, so many threads. But we have to talk about the interrogations that you were touching on before here. I mean, the massive cover-up and threatening debriefings I think they make Hollywood thrillers look wimpish in comparison. Well, so how has the military handled this, would you say, when you've learned about all these the interrogations that these witnesses were subjected to?
There's at least 5 of the military witnesses who have gone on the record to say that they were given what would be regarded as severe interrogations. It's believed to have been done by agents for what's called the Office of Special Investigation, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, AFOSI. They were like the plainclothes police who wore suits, but they weren't in military uniform, but they were still military personnel.
Men in black.
They were doing it. But, well, I wouldn't even say that. But what is clear from some of the interviews of the 5 personnel is that some of them were interrogated more than once by different people. So like Larry Warren would say he was interviewed by somebody who was English, who was apparently a naval officer, as well as the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. Jim Penniston, I think, will say it's a series like 10 or 12 interviews, debriefings, but he was the one that talked about landed craft and whatever. But for me, the most gripping and, in a sense, horrifying account is with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, this major key witness who's a huge figure in the book and the story because the way he links it all together. And he was interrogated, and when I interviewed him, like I said, for this 4.5 hours, I tried to do what was called an enhanced cognitive method interview, which was a special advanced kind of interview that's not designed to be done 40 years after an event. But the premise is that if you've been involved in something that's hugely important in your life, it will be ingrained into your life. If maybe you'd had a car crash or you've been witness to a murder, there are certain events that are like engraved into your memory. And I basically just kind of set him up as best I could and said, will you concentrate? Will you really try to remember? And he said, yeah. And bear in mind, he's over one end of the phone line and I'm on the other, thousands of miles away. So there's no kind of hypnotism or anything like that. But he did, and he worked hard. And when he gets, one of the techniques is to allow the witness to speak. So you set up the interview, you tell him how you're going to approach the interview, and then at some point I'm going to hand the interview over to you, and I'm not going to interrupt you, and you just say whatever you want. So you kind of tell him what you're going to do, and then let him go. Well, he spoke for about 2 hours, free recall, and it's what's called Googling. You go, okay, Because you don't want to interrupt that free recall. Because if you do, it can just stop it there and then. You want somebody to free recall, and I just let him speak, and it's hard. And if you do it for 5 minutes, it's hard. But you try doing it for 2 hours, it's incredibly hard, because all you're doing is okay, and you're wanting him to keep talking, and he did, and it was all audio recorded. And when he talks about the interviews, at one point he breaks down in tears because it was so fresh still in his mind. And he was taken to the base photo lab in a car by military witnesses, Air Force Officer Special Investigation. He was, bear in mind, he was a sergeant. So he's not nobody, he's not a lowest of the low. And he's taken to the base photo lab. And then he says he's taken to an underground facility in the base, under the base photo lab, which Halt denies that there is. But both Warren and Bustinza said that there was a facility underground under the base lab. So he's taken down a long dark corridor, and it's a bit like a spy movie, Harry Palmer, Michael Caine kind of scenario. And he's getting frog marched down along this dark corridor with old little lights, and then he's put into like a little room, and it's a very dim looking room, and there's the two airmen on either side of him. And there's a screen in front of him. And from behind the screen, he hears a voice talking to him. And he can't see the person. And he feels like he's under a prisoner. And at some point, they're saying to him, bullets are cheap, the two airmen on either side. Your family. Think about your family. You saw this. I didn't see this. And at one point, when they do threaten him with his life, he's really panicking then, because he feels helpless, and at the same time he's feeling disgusted that the Air Force can treat him this way when he's joined up to serve his country and he's done nothing wrong, and he's been threatened with his life. And the raw, well, you've read the book, the raw bit where he's talking about that, I say, is palpable. And when I read it back in the process of proofing it, because I'd obviously had to do the transcription from the audio, and that took 2 weeks to do. Such was the length of the interview. You couldn't do it in one go because it was just so overpowering, and it took a long time. Handwritten, because that's the easiest way to do it, and then you type it up and correct it dead easy. But anyway, that 2-week process of doing that long transcript of 4.5 hours. But when I read it back, which is what I do in the proofing, you do it like an actor to see if it reads right. And you put in the odd commas in there and full stops there, because he's not thinking that way. It's just coming out. So you've got to kind of put it into some kind of block. And when I read it back, and I actually start by saying what follows is a really palpable, thought-provoking interview interrogation where he's terrified, basically. But he's disgusted that he's been treated like this. And he said afterwards, I felt like going AWOL. Just running away. Now, for a sergeant to think that is absolutely disgusting, that he's been threatened for having joined his country to serve his country, and then he's then treated like a criminal. It's the most powerful testimony, in a sense, in all of the book, in terms of the real dark area. And one of the other things he also talked about in the forest was that when he's out in the forest and he's seen UFOs, he says, I felt so vulnerable. We'd had to hand over our weapons, and it's like go out into the unknown with no weapons to defend yourself with. And he didn't know what he was going out into. So the sheer fear factor, and then the seeing all these weird, wonderful things flying around. It's like, I feel so vulnerable. And he said many of the airmen felt the same. And I think
then he's debriefed in this terrifying way afterwards. I mean, thank you for that.
It was, yeah. So for basically just getting caught in something beyond his control, at least 5 of the airmen were subjected to terrible interrogations, and even Halt has gone on record several times saying some of the men got treated terribly afterwards.
Yeah. But he was never interrogated himself.
No, that's the odd thing. No. Now, you could think, well, it's his high rank, but I think it goes back to, no, you'll play a role. I can't prove it, but I think he was. You stick what's in the memo.
Part of a deal.
Else,
part of a deal with the higher rank.
That's what I surmised. And I can't prove it, but I think that the logical reason why he was never given a hard time is that he was given an option to an agenda. But I can't prove that.
According to several witnesses, these twin bases stored nukes, but I think Air Force has never admitted that until this day. Has it?
No. To this day they haven't. However, I came across a document that is in the beginning of the book where we talk about nuclear weapons. This is away from the admissions from personnel I'd spoken to. There is a document. I forget the name of the guy who wrote it, but it's in there, and it says that under Bentwaters it housed 25 nuclear weapons.
Yeah. And do you think that the extraterrestrial activity that was witnessed, I mean, if we just establish that that's what it was, had to do with the fact that these bases stored nukes? Is that what you think?
Yes, my premise has always been that, and then it was further reinforced by my research. A lot of people don't realize the context around why these events probably took place. And the context were that at the time of late December 1980, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the borders of Poland. Now, Poland was still then under the Soviet Union's wing, and they were threatening to rebel under Lech Wałęsa and the Polish shipyard workers in Gdansk. And so it looked like the Russian army was going to move in and quash the rebellion, as they'd done in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, for those of you who are a little bit older. And so that was obviously a possible third world scenario. And then the other thing that was happening was in the Middle East, which is always a potential powder keg, and there was 52 Americans being held by Iran. The 52 American hostages. So not only did you have Soviet aggression likely in Poland, but you also had this destabilizing potential in the Middle East because the Iranian hostage crisis. So it was a really difficult time. Now, put this in context. Colonel Halt, he now denies it, but Colonel Halt told me on 2 occasions, one of which was witnessed by my then wife, Lynn, that there were more nuclear weapons at Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. Now, it was a nuclear base. It was allowed to have nuclear weapons. However, it's the amount of ordnance. Now, if you take Halt's words to me literally, then it's why they turn up at a point of world tension. I think there was a nuclear inspection. And Steve Longero, that witness that came forward, who had been on the same training course as Warren, he said that he was initially just gone on shift. He'd only been there a few days. He'd gone on shift, and he was walking around with an experienced airman inside the nuclear weapons storage area when he sees a UFO, and the man who was with him as well. And the UFO shines a beam down into the nuclear storage area bunkers. Now, it's just one long row of bunkers, and it's called the hot row for obvious reasons. And he said it did this pendulum motion with the beam of the arc, and it moved deliberately under control, going down the entire length of the weapons storage area as if it was scanning what was underground all the way along. And I think that ties in with these quotes that I've said to you about more nuclear weapons. So at time of world crisis, there were more nuclear weapons there that potentially could destabilize things in some way for our visitors.
And you also have a theory that the nukes were after these events were moved secretly, of course, to another location because they could have been
affected,
damaged or affected by these beams or something like that.
I can't prove it. One of the
have indications of that.
Well, there's nothing that you could nothing that would stand up evidentially. There are stories. One of them by Munro Nevels, who was part of the group with Hull. He went in a documentary in the mid 2015, 16, something like that, and said that he understood it that 2 nuclear weapons were taken away and flown to Germany to be inspected or whatever. So whether they were affected, we don't know. but there's no evidence to prove that. It's just a story.
But it wouldn't be the first.
I suspect that they were affected, but I can't prove
it. Wouldn't be the first time that extraterrestrial activity has been noted in the vicinity of nuclear facilities, right?
No, there's a huge correlation between UFOs sightings over nuclear weapon storage areas, nuclear powered craft. If you think of the Nimitz incident, that was a nuclear powered cruiser, aircraft carrier, nuclear power plants, and that goes all the way back to 1940s. So there seems to be a genuine correlation between, I think, ET being in some ways basically saying that nuclear weapons are not a good thing, which they're not. And I suspect, and I've been saying it for around 10 years now, that in our deepest ocean trenches we probably do have alien bases, because it's probably their habitat as well. And if they basically kept themselves to themselves for thousands of years potentially, if we went into an Armageddon, a nuclear holocaust, then the planet would be destroyed and their habitat would be destroyed too. So I think that's maybe why they show up at Rendlesham. But there's clearly links with the precursor sightings and now this December 79 sighting that says that they've been showing interest for a long time in nuclear weapons at Bentwaters. And don't forget, historically speaking, I only make a brief reference to it, there was a very famous UK UFO sighting in 1956 called the Lake and Heath Bentwaters UFO sighting, that again relates to the base. So it's not the first time they'd shown up, and I suspect that with the amount of nuclear weapons that were stored there, that were probably in full breach of the armament agreements between the two countries, the UK and the US, that's why they turn up. I think it was a nuclear inspection at a time of world crisis.
Fascinating. Now, there are some loose ends, of course, as naturally in a big thing like this, where there are so many connected events and all that. I personally am extremely interested and curious as to what happened to Jim Penniston's camera roll, for instance, and the alleged, as you've been talking about, video footage from the fourth night there on the field. What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, as to whether the camera roll and the videotapes exist somewhere, and in that case, where? And are there any other loose ends that you would really, really like to be tied together now?
There's lots of missing evidence that I think from this case, and one of the things that emerged in the book was that I'd spoken to three people, or at least three people. Talk about two which I'd spoken to. At least three people mentioned, really for the first time, that routinely all of the radio transmissions from each of the different security police nets, so that you've got law enforcement, security, and the weapon storage area radio frequency, they were routinely reel-to-reel audio recorded. Now, nobody's ever mentioned that. Certainly Colonel Halt has never mentioned that. Jim Penniston's never mentioned that. And certainly Colonel Williams, when he was alive, never mentioned that. Well, that's crucial, because that meant that all the shifts, activity, audio transmissions could have been played back. They did exist at one time. And Adrian Bustinza, this great linking witness who I had the 4.5 hour conversation with, he says that at one time he was sent an envelope, an unmarked envelope, didn't know who'd sent it, and in it were 3 audio cassette tapes of the 3 command frequencies from one of the nights he was involved. So that backs that up. That unfortunately, in a moment of depression, he burnt them. He burnt them years later.
So unfortunate.
Many years later. But nevertheless, 3 people have said that all the radio transmissions were routinely recorded. So that evidence did exist, probably still does, but under lock and key, you'll never get to hear it. Obviously, as we've said, I do think there's corroborative testimony now to say that the event was filmed, the second landing, as was mentioned by Bustinza, Warren, and also Captain Mike Verano. So that's 3 people there who were directly involved in that second incident. That I believe that evidence took place. The evidence was recorded on motion picture film, movie camera. So this is moving images. And there is another witness who comes forward when Ray Boucher, this MUFON investigator, was doing his 3-year study between 84 and 86. He spoke with a lady called Ann Turner, who was the FOA, Freedom of Information person at the Pentagon. And she admitted to him that she'd heard pilots talking about film from Bentwaters, but when she looked in her records, there was no reference to it. So she'd heard pilots privately talking amongst themselves about having seen film. So that film almost certainly exists still, but we'll probably never get to see it. So there are lots of loose ends. The story on Jim Pennison's photographs, he took them to the base photo lab, 36. It was a good camera, he said. He took a reel of 36 photographs. He went back a couple of days later and they said they've come out fogged. Yeah. So he never got to see them. The question is, they probably didn't come out fogged and they're still there somewhere.
It was sent to Germany, wasn't it? To a base in Germany?
Yes, Ramstein in Germany. And then on to Washington, I would think, which is where most things go. It's a bit like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and if you think about the Lost Ark and that final shot where it's being put into a big warehouse with all these boxes, and you don't know what's... It's kind of a bit like that. Around the world, videotapes of the best footage, documents disappear. Any good stuff never sees the light of day. And just as an aside, the astronaut Gordon Cooper said he was filming over a base in the mid-60s, and he saw UFO land, the legs come out, entities come out, meet with Air Force officials. It was all filmed. He sent the film off. He looked at it, cinefilm. He looked at it, confirmed it was real. He'd filmed it, or one of his people on his plane had filmed it, and it was sent off to Washington, never to be seen again. So it kind of all this really good stuff,
all these stories,
anecdotal stories that suggest that there's a huge amount of evidence seen.
So, sorry. What about the new legislation in the United States you told about in our previous chat here? I mean, the whistleblower amendment and all that. Would that make it possible, perhaps, for some people now to step forward and tell more about these incidents in the Rendlesham Forest?
Potentially, yes, but we don't know to what extent the Americans are going to do with this information. What we do know that since the whistleblower amendment has been passed, that 2 people, Captain Robert Salas, who was down in the 1967 Malmstrom incident with the nuclear missiles being turned off, he's given his evidence to the RO office. We know that because he's gone public about it. And also a guy called Bob Jacobs, who was involved in an incident in the early 60s called the Big Sur incident, I think 64, where he was in charge of an optical team filming missile launches, dummy missile launches, warheads. That film of that incident was secreted away by the plainclothes people who turned up, and that it showed a very clear UFO shining a beam down at a warhead in midair, taking the warhead down and then flying off. That footage never seen again. So you kind of got 2 people we know who've gone to ARO, the new All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. They've given their testimony. Now, we're kind of told or hinted at by the likes of Chris Mellon, who was the former Undersecretary of State for Defence. He's been hinting that hopefully in Luis Elizondo they say that there might be public hearings. Now, congressional hearings this time with witnesses. So for a man, if we talk about Robert Salas, he would finally be able to stand up in a like a courtroom live environment that would be filmed properly, like the other one was that was in May. But that was with 2 intelligence officials, and that was a very disappointing because it didn't really tell you anything. But if we have actual witness hearings where people can finally tell their stories to Congress and the Senate, I think that would be huge, and that could be really a game changer. But we don't know to what extent and how often. But I suspect that some Rendlesham witnesses will give testimony. Now, from my own point of view, I think that many more Rendlesham witnesses, like Adrian Bustinza, like Larry Warren, like Steve Longero, should also get the opportunity to give their testimony, as well as the more famous Rendlesham witnesses.
Gary,
so
what do you hope?
There's a lot happening.
Yeah, there's a lot happening, and let's hope that more will happen. Gary, what do you hope to achieve with this, with your impressive book? Basically,
well, it's kind of you to say that. I'd like to try to change the existing narrative, because I feel as if the existing narrative is wrong. The existing narrative is basically Halt, Penniston and Burroughs, and that's it. For most people who are not familiar with the case, they'll know about the memo maybe, and a couple of incidents, a landed craft on one night and then Halt gets snapped in another night. Well, there's so much more to it. And I think, as the book shows, there are far many more incidents, lots of more people involved, and the current narrative is, I think, being controlled politically, in a sense, for 25 years, to dumb it down, to keep it as it is. And I think to try to break that, the book is going to try to do that by saying all this other witness testimony is just as valid, and in fact, in many ways, untainted testimony should be just as valid and gain such prominence in documentaries going forward, etc. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to change the narrative, because I think politically it's being controlled. There was Halt, Penniston and Burroughs, and then the one person that I thought was also involved in controlling the narrative and has a chapter on his own in the book is Nick Pope, who's the former MOD guy. And I go into his role, which was vastly overplayed. He wasn't an expert in any way. He was a junior desk clerk. He was only at the desk between the ages of 24 and 26. Well, nobody runs a UFO department to the age of 24 for the MOD. And his role in becoming this go-to guy has effectively meant that he could control the narrative of who gets in documentaries, who doesn't. And as with Halt said, who do you want in the documentaries? And he'd say, I want Penniston, I want Burroughs, or whatever. So in a sense, you can see how between the four of them, they've controlled the narrative for 25 years. And yet this story is about many more people. So for me, the book is trying to bring these other airmen stories and say, look, this is a much bigger case. The narrative is wrong. And basically, let's be honest and move forward and work together.
Gary, where should people go now to, if they want to know more, if they want to read your book, for instance, and if they want to know more about your work?
Well, yeah, I'm the editor of UFO Truth magazine, which is www.ufotruthmagazine.co.uk. It's a bi-monthly PDF that goes directly to your email, so you don't have to do anything. I have readers all over the world. It's very easy, and it's sent to you every 2 months. So there's that. The book, Non-Human, this one is now available on Amazon. It's only on Amazon at the moment.
Easily recognizable with that cover there.
yeah. I wanted a basic, stark. I didn't want to, people were saying, well, get your UFO on the front. And I said, no, I want it to be kind of evidential book and a serious book, if you see what I mean. So I wanted to give a fairly plain view. And I think it works, because everybody said that they like the book cover as it is. It's just plain, but it's a good evidential book, which is what I was seeking to do. So the book is available in Amazon in whichever country you're in, and it ships pretty much within 24 hours. So it's only available on Amazon, but you'll find it there. Just put in the title, Non-Human, the Rendlesham. I'm sure you'll put a link up to it, Alan, Anders. And
yeah. Gary, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today again, and maybe we can do it again sometime in the future. So good luck now with your meticulous work on revealing the true relationship between us and extraterrestrials out there, and what's happening with the UFO thing and all that.
Well, I appreciate the time, anytime, Anders, and thanks for talking about the book. I appreciate it.